The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the Assembly, the communications and technology sector is one of the most competitive, innovative, and open sectors of our economy. From fiber optics to 4G wireless service, from the smartphone to the tablet to the connected TV, this sector has been creating new services and new devices and high-quality jobs that come with high-tech innovation and investment. Now, despite a lackluster economy, wireline, wireless, and cable providers invested $66 billion in broadband infrastructure in 2010. The U.S. is now leading in the cutting-edge wireless technologies. If we want this to continue, though, we need to avoid needless bureaucratic red tape and fix broken processes at the FCC. Communications and technology companies and the public deserve a more transparent and responsive government agency. And that's exactly what the legislation before us now would accomplish, bringing transparency, bringing accountability to the Federal Communications Commission. The bill is the fruit of the Energy and Commerce's own open and transparent process. Last May, we invited the commissioners of the FCC to testify about improving their processes, and we heard from them about the process problems that have occurred at the agency when it's been headed by chairs from both parties. This is not about this commission, maybe about a prior commission, but it's about a systemic problem. In June, staff released a discussion draft, and we held a legislative hearing with a diverse panel of experts representing industry, think tanks, consumer groups, academia, and the states. We listened to what they had to say about the various ideas that were on the table, and we began to work to modify those ideas into something that was workable. In response to the views presented at the hearings, as well as additional input from stakeholders and colleagues on both sides of the aisle, we refined the draft legislation. Then in November, the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology held an open markup of the bill at the subcommittee level. Text is there. Everybody had a chance to see it. Everybody had a chance to work on it and amend it. Earlier this month, the committee marked up the bill, the full committee did, with several bipartisan amendments that continued to improve the FCC processes. So in large part, the FCC Process Reform Act asked the FCC to go through a process similar to what we just went through in the committee, on the Energy and Commerce Committee, to actually craft this reform legislation. And then we asked the FCC to implement the kinds of reforms that we implemented in this very House to avoid abuses that had taken place in the past. Now, the FCC regularly issues final decisions without giving the public an opportunity to even review the text that they're considering. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. They actually issue final decisions without giving the public an opportunity to review the text. We don't operate that way in the House, at least not anymore. The transition team that Speaker Boehner asked me to chair after the last election adopted a requirement that people have time to read the bill. A 3-day layover provision's in place in this House now so that the public has a chance to read the bills. We have a chance to read the bills. The press corps in the gallery behind us has a chance to read the bills. What's wrong with asking a federal agency that writes regulations that affect one of the most dynamic industries in our nation, what's wrong with asking them to make their text available? We do that in this legislation. Giving the public, last October, let me tell you part of the problem here. Last October, the agency introduced more than 100 new documents into the record of its universal service proceeding in the last few days of public comment. Giving the public as few as 2 days to comment on thousands of pages of new data isn't right. These are some of the rafts of documents right here behind me in these binders. Can you imagine in 2 days you're supposed to evaluate everything there? As the president and CEO of the Wireless Association said, there are other elements of H.R. 3309, such as the provision aimed at preventing data dumps. This we would call a data dump. Right before an item goes on sunshine, that would represent significant improvements in the regulatory process. Sensible regulatory policies can contribute to the wireless industry's ability to continue serving as a catalyst for innovation, economic growth, and job creation. So we're trying to get the Commission not to do data dumps, to be more transparent. The bill would require the FCC to provide the public a minimum amount of time to review filings and comment on proposed rules. It is your business. After all, the agency ought to let you have a chance to participate. Now, unlike executive agencies, these are the ones under the direct command and control of the President of the United States, the FCC never assesses the cost and benefits of regulations. Not required to, so they don't do it always. They can, but they don't. Now, President Obama issued an executive order that required executive agencies to actually assess costs and benefits of every single regulation they issue. That's from the President of the United States. And his executive order requires a more stringent test for major rules. These are the ones affecting the economy in the area of like $100 million. The FCC is not one of those executive agencies. It does not have to follow what the President of the United States tells the other agencies to do because it's an independent agency. So everything the President's asking all the other agencies to do, in this legislation we're saying, FCC, you should do as well. Now, President Obama appointed a Jobs Council. How do we make America more competitive? How do we improve the processes to really drive economic growth? That Jobs Council called on this Congress last year to require independent agencies like the Federal Communications Commission to actually conduct a cost-benefit analysis before putting more red tape on industry. Go find out what it's going to cost to do what you propose to do. Now, I want to make it clear. We didn't require the FCC to do the more onerous test that the President requires. The bill is less onerous than his own executive order because it takes a lighter touch regulation applied to all regulations and applies it to the FCC's major rules. So we ratchet it down. We're not trying to overburden this agency. But if every other agency of the government can do a cost-benefit analysis and even do a higher, more sophisticated level, what's wrong with asking the Federal Communications Commission to do a light touch review of costs and benefits? And you'll hear arguments that this is all brand new stuff. They've never been done before, can't be done. By golly, we're going to litigate for 15 years. Oh, no, the whole world's going to end. Look, this uses language right out of President Obama's order. The bill requires for major rules, quote, a reasoned determination that the benefits of the adopted rule or the amendment of an existing rule justify its cost, recognizing that some benefits and costs are difficult to quantify. That's in our language. It's also in the President's language. Taking into account alternative forms of regulation and the need to tailor regulation to impose the least burden on society consistent with obtaining regulatory objectives. Virtually all of that language I just read to you is what the President of the United States has put as a requirement on the agencies over which he has direct control. We're saying the FCC is under our control as an independent agency. We're sort of the mothership for the FCC as the Congress. It's up to us to carry out these provisions. They're good public policy changes. The FCC has a substantial backlog that affects small businesses and consumers. 4,984 petitions, 3,950 applications are more than 2 years old. 2 years old. All across the country, people have been asking the FCC to take actions, to solve things, to come to decisions. They do it in a clouded, behind the curtain sort of way, and you sit on the outside as the public trying to grow jobs, invest, and innovate, and you wait. You wait. 2 years is a lifetime for an entrepreneur in the communications marketplace. My wife and I were small business owners for 22 years. We were broadcasters. We've been before the FCC and all. We're not in that business anymore. Been out of it since December of '07. So this isn't about me, except I've witnessed what you have to deal with. So I'm trying to fix it here. 1,083 consumer complaints are more than 2 years old. The FCC's done nothing on them. The bill requires the FCC, therefore, to set shot clocks for decisions so the public will know when to expect an answer. We don't tell them the length of those shot clocks or how they should be done. We're just saying, look at your workload and give the public a gauge of when you will reach a decision. You decide the decision. You decide how long those shot clocks would be because you know better in terms of the management flow of your workload what's appropriate, but set some timelines. Set some timelines. In recent years, the FCC has leveraged its authority to review transactions to accomplish unrelated policy goals and insulate its rulemakings from judicial review. Now, what does that mean? It does so through last-minute side deals with applicants that are often not disclosed until just before a few days or even hours before the FCC approves a deal. One problem with these voluntary commitments is they're not voluntary. If you're trying to get the FCC to approve your transfer of license, The FCC in recent years has used that approval authority to go way beyond any statutory authority they have to issue rules in an area, and they hold you hostage. Outside of the portals, we'd call it extortion, probably. Because what they do is say, look, we only have authority here to decide on transfer your license. That's true. Yeah, we're looking at that. But we want you to go off here and agree to do all these other things over which we have no authority to mandate you do them. We could not do a rulemaking if we wanted to because we don't have the authority under the statute to do it. But by the way, wink, nod, twist your arm. If you don't, and you don't call it voluntary, then you can probably kiss this merger goodbye. I don't think that's an appropriate role for the federal government. And nobody in this chamber should support that kind of activity. And yet, if you oppose this bill, in effect, you're supporting that activity. Now, I know there are some companies out there who aren't real wild about this because they see this as an ability to affect their competitors, Because they say, oh, that's great. We'll twist them at the FCC and we'll force them to do things the FCC couldn't force them to do on their own absent a merger condition outside of their regulatory and legal authorities. And we'll get a little edge in the market. We'll put our finger on the scale. And that's what happens. That should stop. Some argue we should not treat the FCC differently from other agencies. Well, in effect, that's what's happening today. Every other agency is being directed by the President of the United States to do these things we're directing it to do through this legislation. But because it is different, it is an independent agency, none of what the President's suggesting can be applied to the independent agency. Now they say, well, we're going to do this on our own. Well, they may. And frankly, the chairman of the FCC right now, Julius Janikowski, I've spent a lot of time talking to him. He has done some really excellent reforms. But the day he leaves and a new chairman comes in, all those can be wiped out. I think this needs to be in statute so we have good processes and procedures going forward, regardless of who controls what around the FCC in the future. The FCC does act differently. Now, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, known as FERC, is a similar independent agency. But it doesn't operate this way. It actually puts the text of its proposed rules out for public to see before it votes on it. It actually builds its case before it makes its decision. We have an issue going on right now where I've asked the FCC to give me the document they actually voted on as part of this effort on the Universal Service Fund rewrite versus what came out the back end when they were finished weeks later. 751 pages of regulations. They won't give me the documents. You see, it changed behind the curtain. They circulated around in private. They edit it. They've issued their press release, said, here's what we're doing, and then they change it. And then you wait. So the public doesn't have a chance to see what they're actually considering until it's too late and it's final. I think that's wrong. Both sides of the aisle for institutional reform at the FCC. Former White House advisor Philip Weiser said that the agency, quote, is in dire need of institutional reform. State commissioners have been calling for the reform of the FCC's rulemaking process for years. In fact, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, these are the people who are looking out for the ratepayers and the consumers. That is their job. Endorsed several provisions of this bill, including language that the actual language of proposed rule be published for comment. Specify a 60-day comment cycle. Mandate that all commissioners have adequate time to review any draft decision before voting on it, and on and on. This is good, solid government reform legislation. It does not protect the status quo. It does not say, the FCC, keep doing what you're doing it great. Because some of us came here to change how the federal government operates in Washington, to open up the process and make it more accountable and transparent. And that's what this legislation does. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserved.